We've reached out to Master Modeler Rob Spangler. Rob's Western Pacific 8th Subdivision is an HO scale model railroad that represents a proto-freelanced extension of the Western Pacific Railroad set in Utah during 1978 to 1982. Rob is an accomplished model railroader and a master backdrop painter. His backdrops appear on layouts all over the country and in his home state of Utah and all around the Salt Lake City metropolitan area. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, glad to be with you, Chuck. Glad you had me on.
All right, well, let's get going and dig into things here. I saw this and I thought it was awesome. So you started getting an interest in model railroading when you were young. You talked about a cement plant that you'd go to with was it your father, and watch the UP do some switching. He said, trains.
My dad had a regular appointment to deal with some allergy medication and shots that he would get.
Right.
And the doctor that we went to was a crazy old guy that lived in this old company town called Devil's Slide that was put up in a narrow canyon next to the Union Pacific by the cement company. Like, all of the houses in town were like cast concrete, all the streets were concrete. And while he would go up there and we would wait for his appointment, I would stay outside and I would watch the UP switch the cement plant. And at first they had 1950s vintage high hood Jeep 9s and Jeep 9B units out there switching. In the late 70s, they changed that around and we got GP30s and GP30Bs, and that was pretty awesome, right? To sit out there as a kid and watch these Jeep units switching these two-bay cement cars into this huge cement plant. And it just got me into not only watching trains, but also it got me an interest in switching and operation, because I could sit there and see the process of them sorting their cars out as they were switching the industries. And another place that I spent a lot of times, my grandma lived just a few miles away from that cement plant in a town called Echo, which is at the base of Echo Canyon on the Union Pacific.
It's modeled now by Darryl Cruz, is it? And before to the late Roy Smith, who was doing it in N scale.
Yeah, there's been several nice models of Echo out there, and their house was right next to the tracks and, block away from the UP depot. And so I would sit out there and watch them switch cars, because that same local that worked the cement plant also worked a branch line up to Park City that had a phosphate loader, and there's a couple other industry they had up there, a lumber yard. And so I would watch them sort the cars out in their little yard and then take off up the branch line. And then when they came back down the branch, I would see them reassemble the train with their outbounds and get ready to go down the hill towards the Ogden yard and get ready to switch the cement plant. And I always thought that was just really cool, that it wasn't just watching a train go by and then it was done, like it's going around on a loop of track under the Christmas tree. They were actually doing work, and I could see a process. I was going to say, that got the interest in operation probably earlier than most people.
I'll tell you what, I had the same thing happen to me getting interested in broadcasting. I did the same thing. I would listen to radio stations and try to figure out how they played the different songs, and then found out they did them in different musical categories, how they played the commercials and stuff. And, it helped me develop my interest in broadcasting as you had your interest developed in railroading and rail fanning. Now, how'd you translate that into model railroading? Where was the first hobby shop you went and bought stuff at?
Well, I was fortunate in that the area where I grew up here in the Salt Lake Valley had several good hobby shops. There were some to the north of me, some to the south, and I don't remember which ones I went in at what times, but it's like whenever we needed something, we knew which one of those shops eventually would have it. And I saw different, products and things, and saw the books there. So I started stocking up on books. I started getting interested in the magazines and the articles on how to do things, because, with my dad, he always liked to work on his house and tinker with stuff and build things. So I really always had an interest in taking raw materials and trying to make something out of it. So over time, between that and the influence of my mom, who was an artist, and she was a painter.
There it is. I was wondering, son, when we were going to find out where that came from.
So I think that was a really fortunate thing, is I had both of my parents were creative, but they were creative in different ways.
Right.
So, I had a mom that would, she would find a picture. So like, I want to recreate what that is, maybe add my own flourish to it. My dad would look, we would watch things like This Old House together, and, remodel stuff. And so it's like, let's go get some raw materials and go to the lumber yard and make something happen. To me, really translated very well into wanting to do something with the interest I had in trains, because I could build models using the same mentality as, them doing their creative things.
Did you build the layout with your dad?
Yes.
Tell us about that. That's awesome. I got a little bit of a chance to do that with my dad. He fueled my interest in trains with a Penline Santa Fe Super Chief in 1964 that he bought me, and that was it. I was hooked. I
got hooked with the model stuff. I had a great aunt that, she grew up around the railroads too. I had a grandpa that was a railroader, and so she saw, let's see if my grandnephew here would like a train set. And so they went and got me, some bicentennial, because it was right, like 1975 or so. As soon as I had that thing, it's like my dad says, well, you need a layout. You can't just put that thing on the floor, let's build a layout to put this on.
Oh,
and
man.
So I had a layout that he helped build. And at first it was just him doing all the work until I could figure out ways to do it myself. And of course, I screwed a lot of things up and, didn't know what I was doing for a while, but he just sort of let me go and work on that. Together, we actually both kind of built some skills for several years, and he helped me build a couple of layouts in the house.
You build a couple of layouts, you move on. I assume you're married and have a family?
Yep.
How long is it before you're like in your teens or 20s, you had accomplished your skills enough to be able to offer this amazing layout?
It evolved over time. By about the late 80s, my mom and dad put an addition onto the house, and they moved some functions out of the basement that used to occupy one end of the basement. And so they just turned that over to me, and they're like, well, as long as we live here, just fill that with a train room. So that was the original 8-sub layout that also got called the Northern Nevada, and it was the one that ended up in a couple of magazines back in the 90s.
I'm doing some research. I want to see that.
Yep. So it ended up in both Model Railroader and Model Railroading back then. And that railroad is really the one where I got going on my own and created something that I didn't need my dad to really do much with. Because I started that when I was a teenager, and that stayed until actually I met my future wife. Her dad was a railroader. He was a civil engineer that worked with the Union Pacific, and he did things like rebuild the Roseville Hump Yard and rebuild the yard down in Phoenix, and projects that were all over the West. And so she understood, being around people that were into trains. When we got married back in the late 90s, we started looking around for a future home that had enough of a basement that I could fill it up with a train room. And she has always been really supportive of the hobby. So the whole time that we've been together, we've been married nearly 30 years, we've always had a train room in our house.
I'm pretty much the same way since like the mid-90s. It's been interesting. That you have a supportive wife. Mine is fairly supportive.
Sometimes when we were looking for a new house to build after we kind of outgrew our starter home, sometimes I would go look for a place from builders and see their model homes, or she would go look for one, or she would say, oh, I went and looked at that house we were interested in. I don't think the train room is going to be very good for you, so we'll scratch that one off,
Now, how
so
cool!
She was always into that.
How cool is that? You remember the cartoons in the back of Model Railroader? That should have been one.
Right? It really should have. Yeah, this was great because she was not about to let us have a house that didn't have a good trainer. Says, I know you're not going to be happy. I don't want to listen to your crap if you're complaining, so we're going to get you a good trainer.
All right, so we're pretty much up to date. You've had the layout exposed and how you do things exposed on Model Railroad Hobbyist, TSG Multimedia. And then I got to talk to you about my boy Toy Man. That's hilarious. The backdrop paint, was that on a G-scale layout he was doing? Yep,
and what was fun about working with the Dale with Toy Man is that he wanted me to work on a backdrop for him for his large-scale layout that's in his garage mahal, as he calls it. And he just watched me do it for a couple of times. I just went down there, I think, twice, and Dale watched real intently, and then the next thing I know, he's sending me pictures. Well, I think I learned enough from watching you that I've started to do this myself. And so he's actually doing a fantastic job on his own backdrops and scenery and stuff, and he just sort of took off on his own just by, sheer process of osmosis, watching me work there by him, and that was really cool.
All right, so how about Lee Nichols and James Gronwald? You did their backdrops for the Utah, Colorado Western, and the DRG. Did they take over that ability?
Not really. They'd done some different things, because I'd been doing backdrops for other people here and there starting before I could drive. We discovered Lee's Railroad during a layout tour, because he's not far from the Golden Spike Historic Site in northern Utah.
That's awesome.
During one of those tours, and he talked about wanting some backdrops, and a friend of mine that was here locally had been helping him with backdrops, but wasn't necessarily able to get up there to keep up with it, because Lee's one of those guys that always likes to change things up all the time, and he would change the scene around, need a new backdrop, and need somebody to go back up and give him something else. Eventually, I started to take that over. I learned a lot from having to adapt, the backdrops to the different styles of layouts that these different people have. And, they would change how their techniques were working, so I'd have to change the backdrop to match what they were doing in the foreground. So I learned a lot by, going back up and patching up Lee's Railroad over the years. James is a guy that I met at a layout tour at my house. He and his wife were going around on a layout tour for the local model club, and he had started to have an interest in the hobby and was building a layout at his basement. He knew that he wanted to do better. James is a good craftsman. He's a woodworker. He reminds me a lot of my dad with his love of trying to make stuff with your hands and working with tools. And he realized that he wasn't doing as well with his appearance of his railroad as he wanted to. So he was trying to gain inspiration with these layout tour visits. And so he invited our round robin work group over there to give him some ideas, and we were certainly glad to do that. And the next thing you know, James is ripping out all the old stuff on his railroad, because he's learning. The guy's a prodigy. He's learning from everything and adapting and figuring everything out on his own. And he has become this outstanding modeler over the last several years that we've known him. He's gotten super with the scenery. He doesn't really want to do his own backdrops, at least not yet. So I've been over there doing those for him. But yeah, that guy's a quick study.
Yeah, and then you told me about a couple of other guys that are in the club. Call it Club Rob. Doug Jolly, yeah. Steve Lodgett, and Pat Bray. Tell us about them.
Steve Lodgett's one of my oldest friends. I met him when I was about 12 years old. There was a railroad museum project at the Ogden, Utah Union Station. And I met him and the crew that were working on that railroad in about 1980. My mom actually became one of the backdrop artists working on that project. I started to help up there. My dad helped him build some stuff up there. And we met Steve, and they had this Friday night kind of round robin work group that I've been a part of ever since. I've started to work with Steve on a couple of his different home railroads. He had one in a garage behind his house for a number of years that never really got that far to the point where we were doing backdrops and scenery. And then back in the 90s, he bought his current house, and it's got a really nice train room, and been working with him on and off ever since. Pat Bray is one of the operators from Lee Nicholas's place. So I've known Pat forever, back when he worked with the SP, and now he's retired. One of my inspirations for doing industrial structures. He's one of these creative guys that can take just a pile of stuff out of your scrap box and your workbench and create something incredible out of it.
Is he responsible for some of your inspiration for Junction City?
Yes, he is. Absolutely. Pat's railroad is full of cool industries that can see a spark come from that guy, and he can create something out of nothing. And I really like that type of mentality where you don't need a kit. You can just, look at raw materials and make something neat happen. And then Doug, I met Doug through mutual friends, also back in the 80s. He had a little HON3 railroad, and he was getting into operation with HON3 and command control. And so he is another creative mind, that word again, that he likes to scratch build things and tinker with stuff. And he eventually got into SN3. In fact, later today, I'm going to go down and help Doug work on some scenery on his SN3 railroad. There's just these people that I meet, and I've always found some little bit of inspiration from a different thing that each one of these guys has done. I've been really lucky to meet all of these outstanding modelers and really good guys over the years.
See, that's awesome. And the Salt Lake City metro area is so awesome because it's so huge that, you talked about at one time, it's like most every city in the West or even in the East or Midwest too had like like 4 or 5 just train shops. You guys have continued to have a high level of creative, there's that word again, modelers that you guys are all learning from, that you can go to see their layout. They can come to the 8 Sub, because there's very few clubs and brick and mortar stores anymore for us to be with boots on the ground for the hobby. And digital's really helping out.
Yeah, digital's really a help. I think the online community is such a big boost to the hobby. And it's too bad that there were some old fuddy-duddies that were so slow to embrace that. But now you can meet and collaborate and get ideas in real time from people around the world now. You don't just have to rely on, who does your friend know here in our hometown and who's got a railroad in the basement that I wouldn't have heard about otherwise. You can get on social media and the various, websites for the online magazines and all that, find out people to get inspiration from everywhere now.
Do you feel there's a changing of the guard as far as all the model railroad, exceptional modelers that we looked up to? So it's like we had several levels of old school model railroaders. We go back to Jim Heidegger, Alan McClellan, Malcolm Furlow, the Tony Coasters, the George Selios, David Barrow, now Lance, yourself, Tom Klimowski, Tom Johnson. The same thing in scenery too. I mean, now we've got guys that are scenery guys making scenery like Martin Welberg. Before it was like David Frary and we had Lou Sassy. Changing of the guard. It doesn't equate it to music. There's always new artists coming along in like a 10 or 20 year cycle. We're having the same thing happen in this hobby now, do you think?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I agree. And I think that one of the great things that's happening with this is when somebody comes up with a new idea and they post it out there for everybody to look at, immediately somebody else can try it and refine it. And, instead of, back in the days of the old brick and mortar hobby shop where you might learn something when you go in there once a month and run into a guy, or wait for a magazine to come out, and the propagation delay on magazines, it might be years before an article shows up. We can refine ideas quickly. Somebody comes up with a new way to make trees, 3 or 4 days later, half a dozen guys have posted on ways to improve the technique, and we're off and running and making something better. One of the other great things about this is how you can share. Back before online media, you pretty much had, a photo that you could take to your buddy, or you could invite people over to your house. Well, now you can get online and share with somebody that's, 10,000 miles away. And I think that's a great inspiration to be a hobbyist, because you can either get the kudos from the people that maybe you admire. It's really great when you post something and somebody whose work that you look up to comes back and say, hey, I like what you're doing. That gives you instant validation, and you want to go back to the train room and do more.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening now. I'm able to make communications with a lot of top-notch modelers like yourself, and it really helps. I mean, I don't care if you would have said, that sucks. I've been a member of Railwires Forum, which is a back east, and they're mainly into a bunch of East Coast roads, but it's an N-scale forum. And these guys are insane. They're like, if you put something up that doesn't look good, they go, dude, really? That sign's out of scale. Did you forget your ruler? They do it in fun. They don't do it like the old codgers used to do. What are you trying to do, boy? So it's done in fun,
Right. And the fun and the inspiration that comes from that, and it inspires you to do something. It's like, well, if you want to rise to the challenge, well, I'm going to prove that I can learn from this. And a few days later, or however long, you come back and say, well, here's my next effort. What do you think? So if you want to take the give and take and the jabs the right way and learn from them, you can go back and then get, again, validation that, all right, you have learned. That is better. And you're getting it from not just the codgers down at the train club who may or may not know what they're doing. If you're in some little place, you may not have anybody locally that's actually really good. You can connect online now with people who are really good. You got immediate access to actual gurus who can sort of sit you down and say, okay, here's what you need to do with the colors. Here's what you need to do with paint selection for getting the textures and everything right on this weathering job. And I think the speed is so much different from it just having something that you can take down to the hobby shop next week or go to the club in next month's meeting.
Let's talk about layout design and inspiration, and a couple of questions here, and how you came up with the idea of Junction City, which, if people know the layout, they're going to go see it, from us urging people to go see it and the thousands that have already seen it through other digital sources. Junction City is really the core of everything. That's Ogden.
That's the major terminal on my fictitious railroad. I've always liked yard operation and heavy industry switching. And so I wanted to create something that would give me a place to make up and break down trains in a big yard and an industrial area that would keep somebody busy for a whole op session switching. So I've just taken inspiration from industries in, Salt Lake and Ogden areas and other parts of the world that I visited, and tried to create just something plausible. The WP on its east end didn't ever have its own actual yard. They shared a facility with Rio Grande and Salt Lake at Roper. And so I wanted to create an actual east end of the WP that was their own thing. And that's where I cooked up Junction City. An opportunity to do a what might have been had they opted to build their own east end yard and interchange facility and had more local switching here, because the real WP, they did have switching in Utah, but most of it was west of the metro, like industries out in the desert. So I've got industries out in my desert model too, but I combined that with an actual WP big city industry.
Junction City is kind of, freelance of Ogden. I remember you talk about in your TST multimedia video, kind of framed it so people could see that it is. I've got Ogden on the backdrop. All right, sceneries and structures. I like how in feet of the 8 sub that's only 8 to 12 inches wide, and you fully represented long industries that only go back like maybe, I think you were saying like an inch or so, if that. Yep. Just a great way to model and save space. Have our eyes, when we look at it, get sucked in. Boomer calls it a postage stamp scene, like when you look at the concrete plant or one of your distributors that are there too that's only like, a foot or so with the backdrop in the background. Was it in the plan, or was, as you do proto-lancing or freelancing, did this just come about?
I designed the railroad around the operation that I want to have. That becomes the kind of the foremost consideration of how the track plan fits in the room. And so some of these narrow scenes just sort of occurred as a necessity. It's like if I want to have the industry switching and the open running between towns that, fits the vision that I have, I got stuck with some narrow scenes. So I don't mind that for all the inspiration of, the modelers that have done great structures that I've gotten to like my friend Pat Bray and others. I can see where they can create a really great industry in a really small amount of space. And so I just figure if I only leave myself 10 to 12 inches, I can build a building flat and create something that's entertaining to switch and still looks good. Because when you're standing there at the track and you're looking at the wall of an industry, you're just seeing, one wall facing you. You're not seeing the whole depth of the thing. So it's always been okay with me if we can just do a building flat or something limited. If you do a good job building it and you have a decent backdrop and the track is finished nicely, so what if it's not a deep scene?
So let me ask you about those flats. Are they solid or, styrene with supports? Because I wondered that when I was rewatching your video.
Yeah, they're all just hollow, made out of either kit parts that are, hacked up and tend to have like 60,000 styrene, bracing behind them so that they don't warp and stuff. And I do a lot of those buildings out of just sheets. I'll go to a plastic distributor and buy like a 4x8 sheet of 60 thousandths plastic and just go to town and make a building out of that stuff and brace it however much is necessary to keep it in one piece and keep it straight. So yeah, they're just little hollow things, and most of them are fairly inexpensive to build and fairly quick to build.
Our good friend Joe Fugate, this is kind of a sidebar thing, brought this up when he talked about his Toma thing. He also talked about having the layout. I noticed the 8 sub is in its own place. Where's your shop?
Now, this is the oddball part of how I model is
the kitchen table.
I actually have like a sheet of leftover OSB sitting on the floor, and I tend to do most of my modeling sitting on the floor under the layout.
Oh, wow.
A lot of that is like if I'm building something out of big pieces of styrene, like I'm building a big industry, it ends up occupying your whole workbench if you're trying to sit at a bench, and it's just easier for me. Like if I've got a building that's 5 or 6 feet long by the time it's done, it's just easier for me to work on the floor.
That's crazy. Where are all your tools and paints and
they're sitting on that piece of OSB on the floor.
All right, we want to see that in your next TSG multimedia or MRA post. I want to move on to some scenery and structures because your scenery's been praised as museum quality, and so you've divulged this before. I love how you do Sagebrush. I loved how you've done roads. I've stole your idea on how to do roads. What techniques or materials do you find most effective for modeling the Great Basin terrain?
The Great Basin it's an interesting place to model. There's just not a lot of big vegetation.
That's the hardest. It's the hardest. People say, because I do desert too, they go, man, that's got to be easy. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
It's not. One of the things that people that model, say, Appalachia have over us is you can use trees to hide an awful lot. You can use them to hide tracks disappearing. You can use them to hide joints between 3D and 2D. I think it's a challenge. It's been interesting to rise to figure out ways to get 3D and 2D to work together on narrow seams that you don't have the advantage of big vegetation to actually cover up anything. I've had to discipline myself to really work on making the shapes work right. And I think a lot of my interest in working on the backdrops has been that I need to use that backdrop to convey a lot of information, because if you're just dealing with a big empty valley full of sagebrush, there's just not enough information about where you're at in the world just with the 3D scene. So you need the backdrop to help place you where you really should be if you're out there, rail fanning this.
What did I first say to you when I first met you a couple of years ago? I called it expansive minimalism.
Well, yeah, and we have one of the things in the northern part of the Great Basin is there is a lot of grass. There's bunch grasses everywhere. And, they start out green in the spring and turn yellow by May. That at least relieves me of having to model individual shrubs everywhere, because I can get away with a lot of static grass and things to represent kind of a carpet of vegetation to finish the scene. So, if you're modeling someplace that has saguaro cacti and creosote bush and that type of stuff, I think there's probably some bigger challenges there, and it's probably more time consuming to model. You can crank out sagebrush pretty quick, and you can certainly put static grass on quick. In that regard, the northern Great Basin has some advantages for modeling compared to some other deserts.
Now, your sagebrush is awesome, and you've talked about it and showed how to make it. There was another guy, his name is Alan, and I'm trying to think. He does the Union Pacific over Sherman on a guy's layout. You know the guy I'm talking about there in Arizona?
Cornville.
Cornville, those guys. Isn't that awesome?
Yeah, I've been there. Yeah, he does a really super job. And, talk about, inspirational modeling. He really does a nice job with, I like their backdrops that they do there too, because they have a photo backdrop thing.
Yeah. And I'll tell you who's doing that too, who must have saw it, was Daryl Cruz, who's doing the UP Evanston and HO. That's massive. That layout is so big, he has to use woodland scenic stuff. He just can't afford to I'm going to get 6,000 sheets of Wellberg stuff and use real dirt and stuff. So actually making it look really good, because he just got done doing Echo, and he's doing I-84 through Echo now, because he does a new update every Sunday. Sometimes I guess you can use these commercial products. It's all how you put it together, and as you say, be able to blend the layout, the backdrop, and the scenery all together, and the operation of the railroad that you're modeling.
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's fun to do. Yeah, some of those European products, they're not necessarily intended for what we're using them for, but we can certainly find little pieces of them to figure out how to, turn it into U.S. landscapes and the western deserts and things.
The Haken stuff. All right, so sage. How do you model sage?
The sagebrush technique I eventually have settled on is variation of scrub pads that they're from 3M. Over time, they've been sold as different textures and under different brand names, and I don't even know what they're called these days. But they're a kind of a coarse gray material that tends to be good for stripping paint. They have different colors of them that are good for, I've seen the brown ones, these gray ones are pretty good. And so found out that you don't really want to tear those apart with your fingers unless you want to rip your skin off. So I started using tin snips to cut them apart. Take these things and hack them into a bunch of little chunks, and, talk about ways to share with your buddies and have them come up with a new technique off of something you're already doing that you go, duh, why didn't I think of that? So James Gronwald here locally, one of our members of our work group, he got a cheapo coffee grinder, and he started throwing these scrub pads into the coffee grinder. And so he spits out sagebrush out of this coffee grinder without having to sit there and cut them out into individual pieces the way I was doing. It's like, well, there's a work smarter, not harder solution. And so that's a really good way to create these sagebrush. Just throw those scrub pads into something that you can chop them up. And then I use like some toothpicks, put them on a sheet of foam, spray them with some heavy duty spray adhesive like 3M Super 77.
Right.
And then use like some of the Velberg products or AMSI foam when you could get that, or some sagebrush color from AccuRail. Yeah, availability of materials is fun. At least in the age of the internet, we can go online and find stuff because, some of the brand names we got used to using over the years have sort of faded away. I'm glad for places like Scenic Express where you can go online and find a ton of stuff, and they have so much availability that, at least you can find something close to what you need.
All right, let's talk about, everybody wants to know about operations, the kingpin, ladies and gentlemen, of the 8 Sub.
Well, yeah, operations are a way to make the project come to life because, your creativity of creating something to look at, every so often you want to see it do something, right? That's the great thing about model railroading is that we have models that actually do stuff. Every aspect of the hobby to create something that really works for themselves, but they like to share with others. And so you can bring everybody together, almost like a role-playing game sort of a thing where you just hang out, you give your buddies a lot of crap, and you make fun of each other for several hours, and then you go out to eat or fix something on the barbecue, and you just have a good time. Even people that don't have time and space to put something up themselves, you can come over and run with us and share equally.
What's your philosophy on weathering and detailing your rolling stock? And I ask you that because I see it lightly weathered with dust, which would represent the Great Basin, whereas you're not going to see a lot of rust and grease like rolling stock from the east on your predominant western rolling stock, right?
Yeah. For weathering rolling stock, part of the reason why my stuff looks the way that it does is I look at some of these weathering gurus, and I frankly don't think I'm nearly as good as they are.
Man, they are really
I can
good.
Create rolling stock that has some dust and a little bit of rust here and there, and do some washes. And I'm not quite as good at creating the crazy rust buckets. So the era that I'm modeling of the 1970s, early 1980s, rust bucket rolling stock, the way that we're used to seeing it today, really wasn't that prominent. I sort of adapted my skills and my era to create something that works for what I can do and what I can create.
Constructions and techniques. So what would you do differently if you were to start this layout again from scratch? Everybody wants to know that. For everybody, it's like, I know what I'd do. Go back to HO.
The layout that I have now, I don't know if I do a lot different. When we talk about advice for somebody that might want to put up a big railroad, the advice I would have is don't until you've built a small railroad.
Right. Do a shelf. Everybody's talking about that. Everybody's tending to preach, and it's coming from Lance, which is great, is to start a small shelf layout.
Gauge what your interest is and what you like to do. If you like the creative stuff, then go down the avenue of learning from the guys that want to teach you to do creative things. I think Lance Mendheim is one of our best thinkers in the hobby today. He has a great newsletter that he puts out online that you can sign up for. And, his websites and his books got some great advice. And one of the big things is don't bite off more than you can chew. Learn by doing something that's small and that's attainable. Because I think there's plenty of people in the hobby that would probably be great modelers in the long run, but we lose them because they take on these overly ambitious projects before they know what they're doing. They don't have their skills really figured out yet to know what to do when they start the big project. And they don't realize that they're taking on something that's not going to line up with their interests in the long run, and they just burn out. And you got to just figure out where your niche is and be happy there. And one of the reasons why I don't look at my current layout and think I want to go back and change a lot is because I've had all this experience building smaller layouts and working on other people's railroads too, and operating on other people's railroads. And, if we want to get into more advice for people getting into it, visit as many layouts as you can.
Yep.
Figure out if you can meet one of your friends from online that has a layout that's inspirational to you. See if there's somebody that is in an area that you're visiting. If you don't have anyone close, go see what you can see of them in person, and then go see another layout and go see another. And especially if you can find groups that operate, if you want to get into operation, because you're going to have as many different philosophies of operation as you got guys with layouts. That way you're not necessarily taking bad advice that's not going to work for you, because the more that you can experience, the more you can figure out, hey, that's what works for me.
Great advice and philosophy from Rob Spangler. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me about stuff. I love it. I've been able to shoot you pictures and you go, nice, great. You've never once said, that sucks.
No, that's because, and no, Chuck, and I don't BS people. If it sucked, I'd have said something. So I like to build people up and give them honest feedback. But I can see the wheels turning. I can see you learning, and it's just great to see. I hope that some people can take some inspiration from the words that we've had here today, and want to go out and have some fun with their hobby. And it's been really great talking with you.